New York was never built only upward. Some of its most deliberate decisions were made underground. Long before skyscrapers defined the skyline, engineers were already carving silent paths beneath the city, paths never meant for commuters, never printed on public maps, and never discussed outside a narrow circle of authority. On paper, New York's subway system is one of the most documented infrastructures in the world. Lines, stations, maintenance tunnels, everything appears accounted for. But certain blueprints tell a different story. In archived transit documents from the early 20th century, there are recurring gaps. Segments marked auxiliary, routes labeled non-revenue, stations with no listed entrances. At first glance, these appear harmless, technical anomalies, planning remnants, abandoned ideas. But when overlaid with federal security records, a pattern begins to emerge. These gaps don't align with population needs. They don't serve transit efficiency. They don't connect neighborhoods. They connect power. During World War II and the early Cold War years, New York was quietly reclassified, not just as a city, but as a strategic command environment. It housed financial control, diplomatic movement, and emergency succession planning. If Washington fell, continuity had to survive somewhere, and survival requires mobility. Internal memos from the Office of Civil Defense referenced secure subterranean transit options for executive relocation during national emergencies. These options were never named publicly, but they were funded. Large sums were redirected through transportation budgets, disguised as infrastructure reinforcement, tunnel reinforcement, or future-proofing. Yet no public subway expansions matched those costs. Some tunnels were built without stations. Some stations were constructed without public access. And some routes were completed, tested, and then erased from public documentation entirely. By the 1950s, select New York stations began operating under dual status. To the public, they were standard platforms. But behind sealed walls and unmarked doors, parallel corridors existed, cleaner, wider, quieter. These corridors were never advertised. They didn't need to be. They weren't for the public. Former transit workers, speaking decades later, described sections of tunnel they were ordered never to enter, tracks without power, doors without signage, lights that were always on. When questioned, supervisors gave the same response every time: federal use. No explanation followed. What makes these routes different isn't just their secrecy, it's their design philosophy. They weren't built for mass movement. They were built for speed, isolation, and discretion. No platforms crowded with people, no intersecting lines, no delay tolerance. A direct path beneath one of the busiest cities in the world, designed to move a small number of individuals without being seen. By the late 1960s, as political assassinations and civil unrest reshaped America's sense of security, these underground systems gained renewed importance. Cities above ground were unpredictable. Below ground, control was easier. The question is no longer whether New York has hidden tunnels. The question is, who were they built for? And are they truly unused today? Because infrastructure like this isn't dismantled, it's preserved. And preserved systems usually have a future purpose. The most unsettling detail about New York's hidden subway routes isn't that they exist. It's how deliberately they were kept out of sight. In standard transit planning, even abandoned projects leave a trace. Budget overruns, public hearings, contractor disputes. But certain underground segments beneath Manhattan leave no civilian footprint at all. No press coverage. No city council debate. No archival photographs, only sealed folders. During the 1970s, a classified continuity of government review identified New York as a secondary executive relocation hub. Not a replacement for Washington, but a fallback. A place where leadership could move, regroup, and operate if national command structures were compromised. For that to work, visibility had to be eliminated. Surface movement was too exposed. Helicopters were loud. Convoys drew attention. Underground transit solved all three problems. Engineering logs from this period reference tunnel reinforcements that exceed civilian safety requirements. Thicker walls, independent ventilation, emergency power systems not connected to the city grid. These weren't subway upgrades. They were containment measures. Some tunnels were built deeper than standard subway lines, far below what passenger rail requires. Their curves were wider, their gradients smoother, not designed for frequent stops, but for uninterrupted travel. And then there were the stations that didn't officially exist. Transit schematics from the era show nodes, labeled only with numbers, never names. No stairways, no fare gates, just platforms connected to secure elevators. Where did those elevators lead? Not to the street. They surfaced inside government buildings, financial institutions, and federally leased properties, places with constant security presence and restricted access. These routes were never meant to evacuate the public. They were meant to preserve authority. Former city engineers later described strict compartmentalization. You were assigned to a segment. You never saw the whole system. You were told not to ask questions. One technician recalled installing signal equipment in a tunnel that had no scheduled trains. When I asked when it would be used, he said, I was told, hopefully, never. That answer didn't mean the tunnel was inactive. It meant its activation depended on a scenario the public was never supposed to imagine. By the early 1980s, as Cold War tensions peaked again, these underground routes were quietly maintained, not expanded, maintained, tracks polished, power tested, communication lines checked, all without appearing in municipal budgets. And then something changed. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many expected these systems to be decommissioned. They weren't. Instead, oversight shifted. Responsibility moved away from local transit authorities and into joint federal city task groups. The language in the documents changed from civil defense to executive mobility, from emergency response to strategic continuity. This wasn't about nuclear war anymore. It was about uncertainty, terrorism, internal instability, unpredictable urban events. A city as dense as New York could turn chaotic in minutes. Moving leaders safely through that chaos required a route no one else knew existed. The existence of these tunnels wasn't denied. It was never confirmed. And that silence was intentional, because acknowledging them would raise another question. If they were built for presidents, are they still reserved for them? The most revealing detail about New York's hidden subway lines isn't their depth or their secrecy, or even their original purpose. It's the fact that they were never officially retired. In 2003, during post-9/11 infrastructure reassessments, multiple internal transit documents referenced what they called legacy underground assets. The wording was intentionally vague. No coordinates, no tunnel names, no public-facing diagrams, but one line appeared repeatedly across separate files. Maintain readiness. access protocols unchanged. Unchanged from when and for whom was never specified. Former federal contractors later described inspection routines that never appeared on municipal schedules. Nighttime access requests filed under non-transport authority. Maintenance convoys entering service tunnels without MTA identification. Security personnel present on site who didn't carry transit credentials, only federal clearance badges. These weren't emergency responses, they were procedures. What unsettles investigators isn't that these tunnels exist, it's that they've been quietly modernized. Deep access corridors show signs of upgrades installed decades after the original construction. Fiber optic communication lines routed through reinforced conduits, sealed power junctions independent of the city grid, air filtration systems rated for chemical and biological isolation. None of this appears in public transportation budgets. None of it is logged as civilian infrastructure, because these tunnels no longer serve transit. They serve continuity. And continuity planning doesn't end when administrations change. What makes these routes especially disturbing is where they lead. They don't connect evacuation shelters. They don't route toward hospitals or public safety hubs. They connect decision centers, financial districts, federal facilities, restricted buildings where policy is written and authority is exercised. Which raises an uncomfortable but unavoidable question. If a sudden national emergency occurred today, one requiring leadership to move without visibility, could it happen? Not theoretically. Logistically. Based on everything that remains quietly maintained beneath the city, the answer is yes. No sirens, no helicopters lifting from rooftops, no convoys drawing attention. Just secure doors closing below street level. New York would continue operating above ground. Subway schedules would remain unchanged. Traffic lights would cycle, markets would open, and the public would never know that something or someone had already disappeared from the surface. Because the most effective escape route isn't fast. It's invisible. And New York's deepest infrastructure was never built for the people who ride the trains. It was built for the people who need to leave without ever being seen. This story isn't about tunnels. It's about who infrastructure is really built for. Comment with your thoughts below, not because there's a right answer, but because the questions themselves matter. The stories on this channel are never isolated. They are fragments of a larger pattern, a system designed to function quietly, long after public attention moves on. If you want to recognize that pattern before the next file surfaces without warning, subscribe. Some routes aren't marked on maps, and some truths don't come to the surface until it's already too late.